my classmates' obsession. In my senior year of high school, I was eagerly looking forward to summer, parties, and finally, a taste of freedom before starting college. The last few weeks of school were intense, filled with final exams and projects, but there was a sense of relief in the air. Everyone was gearing up for graduation and the farewell parties. It was during this time that I met Brian, a guy who was in one of my advanced math classes. Brian was smart, but very quiet, almost invisible. He always sat at the back of the room, never participated in group conversations, and seemed to have few friends. I hadn't really noticed him until the end of the year when he started to approach me. It all began innocently, with him helping me with some math problems I couldn't figure out. I was grateful for the help, especially with finals approaching. Over time, he started messaging me on Facebook, initially about homework and later about more personal things. He would ask how my day was, comment on books and movies he liked, and seemed interested in everything I said. I responded politely, but didn't encourage the conversation much. He seemed harmless, just a lonely guy looking for a friend. Then, on the last day of school, right after the final exam, Brian surprised me by asking me out. He approached me as I was putting my materials into my backpack and, with a nervous but determined voice, said he wanted to take me out to dinner that night. I was taken aback, not knowing how to turn him down without hurting his feelings. He had been so kind to me over the past few weeks. On impulse, I made up an excuse. "Oh, Brian, I'd love to, but I'm heading to Florida with my family tonight. We'll be gone for a few weeks." He seemed surprised but accepted the excuse with a strange smile. "All right, maybe when you get back," he said, not breaking his gaze on me. I agreed, thinking he would soon forget about it. I had no idea how quickly things would spiral out of control. That night, while my friends and I were out celebrating the end of the school year, my phone buzzed with a message from Brian. "When are you leaving for Florida?" he asked. I replied that I was leaving that night, trying to sound casual. But something about the tone of his messages made me uneasy. In the following days, I received more messages from him, asking about the trip, about the weather in Florida, and what I was doing. I found it odd, but continued lying, saying I was enjoying the beach and the sun. Then one night, while I was out with my friends, I got a message that made my blood run cold. "I thought you were in Florida, but I saw you downtown this afternoon." I nearly dropped my phone. How did he know I was there? I started to feel paranoid, looking over my shoulder, searching for Brian everywhere. My friends tried to calm me down, saying he was probably joking, but I knew he wasn't. I decided not to respond to that message, but the fear had already settled in. That night, when I got home, there was a knock on the door around midnight. My heart raced, and when I asked who it was, I heard Brian's voice from the other side. "It's just me, Brian. Can we talk?" I froze in fear. He knew where I lived. Not knowing what to do, I shouted through the door that he should leave, that my dad was about to get home. There was silence on the other side, and then he finally left. In the days that followed, Brian's messages became more disturbing. He wrote long texts saying he was disappointed in me, that I had lied and used him. He talked about how he felt betrayed, that he thought we had a special connection. I showed the messages to my parents, who were alarmed and insisted that we go to the police. At the station, the officers listened and advised me to continue ignoring Brian, but to document any future contact. They said that if he continued to harass me, they would take more severe action. I hoped that would be enough to scare him off, but that night I received another message. This time, it was even longer and filled with confused feelings. He talked about how devastated he was that I had gone to the police, but that he forgave me because he believed I was just confused and scared. My mom decided it would be better for me to spend a few days at my grandparents' house in a nearby town. I thought getting away from home would give me some peace, but even there, I couldn't stop looking over my shoulder, expecting to see Brian around every corner. For a while, the messages stopped, and I began to think it was all over. Maybe the pressure from the police and my dad's messages had finally driven him away. But then, in the early hours of the morning, I received one last message from Brian. It was a long, disturbing text in which he described how he felt lost and alone, how no one had ever understood him. He ended by saying he was leaving, that I didn't need to worry about him anymore. After that message, Brian disappeared. He never showed up at school again, and no one knew where he had gone. I tried to move on, but the experience left me traumatized. Even after graduation, I felt uneasy, as if he was still watching me from somewhere. I never found out what happened to Brian, and I probably never will. All that remains are those creepy messages and the memory of how a simple invitation to dinner turned into a nightmare. I learned to be more cautious, to trust my instincts, and to never underestimate the warning signs, even when they seem harmless. The high school party. The last day of high school was a whirlwind of emotions. This was the moment we had all been waiting for, the end of an era and the beginning of a new one. The school was decorated for the big graduation party, and the night promised to be full of laughter, dancing, and goodbyes. I wasn't exactly the kind of girl who stood out at parties. I was always a bit shy, preferring to stay on the sidelines, observing from a distance. But that night, something felt different. As soon as I entered the gym, the place was transformed. Colorful lights flashed to the beat of the loud music, and everyone seemed to be having more fun than ever. I was trying to fit in, chatting with some friends, when Caleb, a classmate I barely knew, approached me. He was popular, always surrounded by friends, but that night he seemed to be alone. Caleb smiled in a strange way and invited me to take a walk around the school. He said he wanted to show me something interesting. I hesitated. Something about the way he spoke made me uncomfortable, but at the same time my curiosity was piqued. Maybe it was the adrenaline of the moment, the excitement of the last day of school, but I accepted the invitation. We walked through the dark corridors of the school, which seemed even longer and emptier at night. The laughter and music from the party faded as we moved away from the gym. Caleb suggested we go to the school's basement. He said there was something down there that everyone talked about, but no one had the courage to explore. I knew about the rumors. Everyone at school said the basement was haunted, that there was a presence down there that made anyone who entered feel a chill down their spine. I laughed, trying to ease the tension, but inside I was terrified. The stairs leading to the basement were narrow and steep, and the air around us seemed heavier with each step we took down. Caleb was ahead, and I followed closely, my hands sweating cold. When we reached the bottom of the stairs, he pushed the heavy iron door, which opened with a disturbing creak. Inside, the basement was plunged into darkness, except for a dim light bulb on the ceiling that flickered sporadically. Caleb entered without hesitation, and I, trying to seem brave, followed behind him. The air was cold and damp, and the smell of mold was strong. There were old shelves against the walls, full of dusty boxes, as if no one had touched them for years. I was trying to understand why Caleb had brought me there when suddenly I heard a sound. A whisper, low and distant, but clear enough to make my heart race. "Did you hear that?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. Caleb looked at me, but his face was oddly calm, as if he wasn't scared. "Yeah," he replied, without much concern. "Probably just the wind." But there were no windows in the basement, and the sound didn't resemble the wind at all. I started to regret coming. Then I heard footsteps. They were coming from somewhere behind us, but when I turned around, there was nothing there, just the impenetrable darkness. I looked at Caleb, hoping he was also worried, but he was standing still, staring intently at the far end of the basement. "Caleb, I think we should go back," I suggested, my voice trembling. He didn't answer. Suddenly, the basement door slammed shut with a bang, echoing through the empty space. I jumped in fright and ran to the door, trying to open it, but it wouldn't budge. It was locked. I pounded on the door, calling for help, but my voice seemed to get lost in the darkness. When I turned to ask Caleb for help, he was no longer there. He had disappeared. Panic took over me. I was alone in the dark basement, with a locked door behind me and unexplained sounds all around. I tried to turn on my phone's flashlight, but the battery was nearly dead, casting only a faint light that didn't reach far beyond my feet. I needed to get out of there, but I couldn't find another way out. As I groped along the wall, desperately searching for another door, the whispers grew louder, as if dozens of voices were surrounding me, speaking in a language I couldn't understand. The footsteps also grew louder, as if something invisible was walking in circles around me. Every second felt like an endless nightmare. Finally, I found another door in the farthest corner of the basement. With trembling hands, I managed to open it and ran through the dark corridors of the school, not looking back. When I reached the gym, the loud music and flashing lights were a shock to my senses. I was back in the real world, but the feeling of danger was still with me. I looked around, trying to find Caleb, but he was nowhere to be found. I ran to tell one of my friends what had happened, but strangely, no one seemed to remember Caleb. I asked other classmates, and they all looked at me in confusion. It was as if he had never existed. My fear grew, but no one took me seriously. The next morning, I went back to the school to see if I could find any explanation. I went to the principal's office and asked about Caleb. The principal, with a concerned look, told me that there was no student by that name registered at the school. I was shocked. I knew Caleb was there. I knew him, but everyone acted like he was just a figment of my imagination. I spent the rest of the summer trying to forget what happened, but I couldn't. Sometimes, I still heard those whispers when I was alone at home or felt the presence of someone behind me, even when there was no one there. The school basement was permanently locked after that day, and the key, they say, was lost. I never found out what really happened to Caleb, or if he was even real. But whatever it was, it left a mark on me. Since that night, the world has never felt the same. And to this day, I avoid any place with a dark basement, fearing what might be waiting down there, hidden in the shadows, ready to find me again. The presence in the abandoned school. I was never the type to get into trouble, but on the last day of junior year, something in me changed. Maybe it was the adrenaline of finally being free from school, or maybe it was the influence of my friends, but somehow, that night, I got involved in something I still deeply regret. I still wonder what would have happened if we had just gone our separate ways, but unfortunately, we did exactly the opposite. It was a hot Friday, the kind of night when summer was already showing its face. Jason, Mike, Sarah, and I had been inseparable since freshman year, and with the end of high school approaching, we wanted to do something memorable. After our graduation party, while the rest of the class was either partying or planning to leave town, the four of us met at Mike's house. We were lounging on the couch, trying to think of what to do, when someone, probably Jason, suggested we explore the abandoned elementary school on the outskirts of town. Lincoln Elementary had been closed for years, shortly after a fire destroyed part of the building. Since then, the place had been forgotten, overgrown with vegetation, with broken windows and walls marked by time. There were plenty of scary stories about that school, but we always treated them as urban legends until that night. The idea of exploring the place seemed stupid at the time, but we were full of energy and looking for adventure, so we agreed. We grabbed some flashlights from Mike's garage and piled into his car. The road to the school was dark and deserted, and as we got closer, the playful mood from before started to fade. When we finally parked, the abandoned building looked more menacing than in any of our memories. The full moon cast distorted shadows on the graffiti-covered walls, and the trees around the school swayed gently in the night breeze, making sounds that, in that situation, seemed more sinister than they should have. As we walked through the rusty gate, adrenaline started to pulse through my veins. The silence was almost deafening, broken only by the sound of our footsteps on the gravel. We walked through the main entrance, where the doors were wide open, like a dark mouth waiting to swallow us whole. Inside, the smell of mold and rotting wood was overwhelming. The walls were covered in old graffiti, and the floor was littered with debris from the fire. Jason, who was always the bravest of us, led the way with a flashlight in hand, illuminating the narrow hallways. I followed right behind, with Sarah and Mike bringing up the rear. Every step echoed off the empty walls, amplifying the sound almost oppressively. The place seemed frozen in time, with overturned desks, scattered books, and faded murals of children's drawings. Then we heard the first sound, a low noise, like something scratching the floor upstairs. We stopped instantly, holding our breath. "What was that?" Sarah whispered, her eyes wide with fear. Jason tried to calm us down, saying it was probably just some animal that had taken shelter there. But the truth was, no one seemed convinced. The noise continued, now louder, as if something was moving down the hallway above us. Mike suggested we should leave, but Jason insisted we should investigate, saying we hadn't come all that way to run at the first sign of something strange. The truth was, I wanted to leave, but my pride stopped me from admitting it. We climbed the metal stairs leading to the second floor, the steps creaking under our feet. Every step felt like an eternity, and the sound of something dragging continued, now closer. At the top of the stairs, the hallway seemed endless. The classroom doors were open, some hanging precariously on their hinges, others completely torn off. Jason's flashlight illuminated the floor, where we could see scratch marks on the dusty floor, as if something heavy had been dragged recently. Silence reigned again, and for a moment, we thought it was all in our imagination, until we heard a door slam shut behind us. Sarah let out a muffled scream, and we all turned at the same time, pointing our flashlights toward the end of the hallway. There was nothing there, just the thick darkness. But the sound, that sound still echoed in our heads. It was impossible to tell if it was coming from inside the rooms or if it was moving around us. Mike began to back away, muttering that this wasn't a good idea, and I felt the panic growing inside me. Jason, however, stood firm, walking toward the source of the noise. I wanted to call him back, but the words got stuck in my throat. That's when we saw it. In the doorway of one of the rooms, a figure was standing, half hidden by the shadows. It was tall, thin, and its face was obscured. We couldn't make out any details, but just seeing someone there, in that abandoned school, paralyzed us with fear. "Who's there?" Jason shouted, his voice trembling for the first time. The figure didn't respond. It just stood there, motionless, as if watching us. Something in the air was wrong, very wrong. Fear took hold of us, and we all knew, without needing words, that we had to get out of there immediately. Before Jason could say anything, Mike and Sarah were already running back to the stairs, and I wasn't far behind. We ran down the hallway, down the stairs as fast as our legs would carry us. I nearly slipped as I jumped the last step, but managed to stay on my feet. The sound of footsteps behind us, hurried and heavy, made us run even faster. We didn't stop until we reached the front window of the school, the one we had entered through. Mike was the first to jump, followed by Sarah. Jason and I went last, with our hearts in our throats. When we were finally outside, all panting and scared, we looked back at the silent school. The figure hadn't followed us. The building seemed inert, as if nothing had happened. But we knew it wasn't our imagination. We knew there was something, or someone, inside that place, and we were lucky to have escaped. In the days that followed, we tried to make sense of what had happened, but the memories were confusing, fragmented. Jason insisted that we should have stayed and found out what it was, but the rest of us knew it was the right decision to leave. To this day, none of us have had the courage to go back to Lincoln Elementary, and honestly, I hope we never have to. What we saw in that abandoned school still haunts my nightmares. I try to rationalize it, tell myself it was just a person, maybe a homeless person, or someone seeking shelter. But the truth is, deep down, I know it wasn't something from this world. And I'll never forget the empty look of that figure, hidden in the shadows, waiting. For who or what? I'll never know. The abandoned classroom. The last day of 9th grade was supposed to be a celebration. Matt, Ethan, Kyle, and I were all excited for the start of summer vacation. Our school, a typical American high school in a small Midwestern town, was buzzing with life that day. Everyone was saying goodbye, making vacation plans, but the three of us had a different idea. We had been part of the school for years, and since 6th grade, we had heard stories about a classroom in the oldest wing of the building that had been locked up and forgotten. There were rumors that the room had been closed after a student mysteriously disappeared during class decades ago. The story was always told in vague terms, but they said that since then, no one had used the room, and it was left exactly as it had been that day. Many students thought it was just a ghost story to scare the newcomers, but something about it intrigued us. We decided that on the last day of school, we would investigate. The old wing of the school was practically abandoned. For years, the administration had tried to renovate it, But other, more urgent problems always came up. The windows were covered with a thick layer of dust, and the doors creaked at the slightest touch. The lights in the corridors flickered, and the air was always colder there. It was as if that part of the school belonged to another time, forgotten by everyone. Ethan was the first to suggest that we go to room 104, the room where the student had disappeared. It was located at the end of the farthest hallway, where no one ventured anymore. When we reached the door, we felt a strange sense of unease. The doorknob was rusty, but Kyle, who was always the bravest of us, turned it with force, and the door slowly creaked open in a disturbing way. What we saw inside the room was exactly as they described. It was as if time had stopped there. The desks were arranged in perfect rows, covered in dust. Old books were piled on the desks, and the chalkboard still had notes written in a handwriting that seemed to have been made decades ago. The air was heavy, and there was a feeling that we shouldn't be there, as if we were intruding on something forbidden. As we explored the room, we started to feel a growing unease. Ethan was flipping through one of the dusty books, but the pages were illegible, worn away by time. Kyle, always the jokester, grabbed a piece of chalk and wrote his name on the chalkboard, laughing as he did so. I stayed near the door, watching, when I noticed something strange. The door, which we had left ajar, was now completely closed. I walked over to the door, trying to open it, but it was locked. I laughed nervously, thinking one of us might have closed it without realizing, but when I tried to turn the doorknob, it wouldn't move. I called the others, who came over, and we all tried to open the door, but nothing worked. Then the lights in the room started to flicker, and panic began to set in. The atmosphere became oppressive. The silence was broken by a soft sound, almost imperceptible at first, like a whisper coming from somewhere in the room. We looked around, trying to locate the source of the sound, but there was no one there but us three. The whisper grew louder, clearer, but still incomprehensible. That's when Ethan pointed to the back of the room. In the darkest corner, where the light barely reached, there was something. A shadow that seemed to be moving, but so slowly and subtly that at first we thought our eyes were playing tricks on us. But it wasn't. The shadow took on a more defined shape, as if it were coming to life, and started to slowly approach us. Panic took over. We started screaming and banging on the door, desperate to get out. The figure kept coming closer, and I felt the air get colder and colder. Kyle, always the most rational, started trying to break down the door, but it was as if something on the other side was holding the doorknob. The fear I felt was so intense that I could barely breathe. Suddenly, the lights in the room went out completely, and we were plunged into total darkness. The whisper now seemed to be everywhere, around us, inside our heads. We could hear our own hearts beating uncontrollably, and the only thing I could think of was that we needed to get out of there immediately. When the lights flickered back on, the figure was almost on top of us. We couldn't see its face, but the feeling of its presence was overwhelming. In one last desperate effort, we all pushed the door with all our might. Finally, it opened, and we ran out of the room without looking back. The sound of the whisper still echoed in our ears as we ran down the school corridors. When we finally stopped to catch our breath, I noticed something terrifying. It was just Ethan and me. Kyle wasn't with us. We ran back down the hallway, shouting his name, but there was no sign of him. We went back to room 104, but the door was locked again, as if it had never been opened. We knocked, called out, but there was no answer. It was as if Kyle had simply disappeared. We spent hours searching for him, but nothing. Finally, we went to the principal's office and explained what had happened. The whole school was searched, but there was no sign of Kyle. The strangest thing was that no one else seemed to remember him. The school records, the teachers, even his parents acted as if he had never existed. Ethan and I knew the truth, but no one believed us. Since that day, we've never gone back to that wing of the school. Room 104 was permanently sealed, and Kyle's story became just another urban legend. But I know what I saw. I know what happened. To this day, sometimes I still hear that whisper in my dreams, and I always wake up with the feeling that something is watching me. Something that's still in that room, waiting. Maybe waiting for me to come back. The fatal deception. When I was 10 years old, I lived in a small town in rural Indiana. It was a quiet place where everyone knew each other and kids could play on the streets without worry. My daily routine was pretty simple. I'd go to school, come home, and occasionally go to a friend's house to play video games or run around the yard grower. It was at the end of my 4th grade year that everything changed, and what should have been just another ordinary day turned into a nightmare I'll never forget. It was the last day of school before summer break, and the excitement in the air was palpable. The kids were more excited than usual, all eager to say goodbye to school for a few weeks. My mom, as always, was going to pick me up, but that day, a friend, Chris, had invited me to his house after school. Chris and I had been friends since kindergarten, and although we weren't in the same class that year, we always tried to meet up after school. The school let out at the usual time, and I waited at the exit with Chris and some other kids for our parents to show up. That's when a man appeared on the sidewalk, waving at me. He looked to be in his 40s, with short hair and simple clothes, nothing that really stood out. He introduced himself as Chris's uncle, saying that my mom had asked him to take me to their house since she was busy. I was a shy kid and always very obedient. My mom had taught me never to talk to strangers, but since he knew my friend's name and mentioned my mom, I believed him. I looked at Chris, who seemed a bit surprised, but didn't say anything. Maybe he was confused too, or maybe he just didn't want to contradict the man. I decided to follow Chris's uncle without thinking too much. He led me to a car parked a few meters away, an old dark sedan that looked well kept. As soon as we got in, I felt an inexplicable discomfort. He was very talkative, asking questions about my school, my hobbies, things that adults usually ask to make conversation. But there was something in his tone, a strange urgency, that made me uneasy. And that's when I noticed something disturbing. He wasn't heading toward Chris's house. I tried not to panic, but when I asked where we were going, he just said we needed to pick something up first. My hands started to sweat, and my heart was racing. I knew the way to Chris's house well, and we were clearly going in the opposite direction. That's when I realized something was very wrong. I asked again where we were going, and this time, he didn't answer. He just kept driving, not looking at me. Finally, we arrived at a house I had never seen before. It looked old and a bit rundown, with peeling paint and windows covered by heavy curtains. He told me to get out of the car and follow him inside. Every step I took felt like I was getting closer to an invisible danger, but I was paralyzed with fear. He led me to the living room, where the air was heavy and stuffy, as if no one had aired out the house in years. He pointed to a couch and told me to sit down. His tone had changed, now more severe, almost impatient. I didn't know what to do, so I obeyed, feeling a knot forming in my stomach. He then disappeared through a door at the back of the room, saying he was going to get something from the basement. That was the moment, alone in that dark, silent room, when my survival instinct finally kicked in. I stood up slowly, trying not to make any noise. I looked around, searching for an exit. The front door was locked, and there was no key in sight. I decided to go to the kitchen, the only other open door on the ground floor. There, I found an old wall phone, outdated, but it seemed to be working. With trembling hands, I dialed 911, whispering as quietly as I could while explaining the situation. The operator managed to understand what I was saying and promised that the police were on their way. I didn't know how much time I had until the man returned, so I hid the phone under a towel and quickly went back to the living room, trying to act like nothing had happened. My heart was beating so fast that I could barely hear anything else. Minutes passed, but they felt like hours. The sound of heavy footsteps coming up the stairs made me freeze. The man came back to the living room, not realizing my attempt to contact the police, and started talking more agitatedly, as if he was trying to decide what to do with me. That's when I heard a noise outside. Sirens. He looked at me with an expression of pure hatred and ran toward the back door, probably trying to escape. The police arrived within seconds, and soon the house was surrounded. 2 officers came in and found me on the couch, still in shock. They took me out of there quickly, while others went after the man, who, I later learned, was caught trying to jump the backyard fence. After I was taken to the police station and my parents arrived, the pieces of the puzzle began to come together. I found out that the man wasn't really Chris's uncle. He was actually a former coworker of Chris's dad, someone who had been fired months before for inappropriate behavior. Somehow, he had found out that I was friends with Chris and took the opportunity to try to kidnap me. Even today, I can't forget the feeling of absolute fear I felt that day. I went to therapy for a while afterward, and my parents became extremely protective. I don't blame them. They almost lost their child because of one simple mistake, trusting someone who seemed to know just enough to deceive a kid. I learned the hard way that things aren't always what they seem. That was the longest summer of my life. And even now, years later, I still wake up sometimes in the middle of the night with the sound of sirens echoing in my mind, reminding me of how close I came to disappearing forever. The man on the bus. I will never forget the day my senior year of high school ended. It was a hot Friday in June, and the school was buzzing with excitement. Everyone was happy to have finally reached the end, ready to enjoy the summer and prepare for college. I was equally excited, but at the same time, there was a certain nervousness in the air. My daily routine involved taking the school bus home, as I had done for all those years. But that day, something was different, something that still gives me chills just thinking about it. After saying goodbye to my friends, I walked to the bus stop, which was a few blocks from the school. The sun was still high, and the streets were busy with students and residents going about their day. I got on the bus, chose a seat in the back near the window, and put on my headphones to relax during the ride. That's when I noticed something strange. A man got on the bus right after me. He looked to be in his 30s, wearing a heavy coat despite the warm weather. His eyes were dark, and he had a neutral, almost cold expression. At first, I didn't think much of it, but as the bus made its way along the route, I realized he was watching me. I tried to convince myself it was just a coincidence, that maybe he was lost in thought, but the discomfort grew with every stop. Every time I looked at him, he would quickly look away, but then I would feel his eyes on me again. I tried to focus on my phone, on messages from my friends, on anything that would distract me from that unease. But the feeling of being watched wouldn't leave me. The atmosphere on the bus seemed to change, and the route that was once familiar now felt oppressive, almost claustrophobic. The route I took home every day suddenly felt different, as if the bus was taking longer to reach my stop. I wondered if I was being paranoid, but something inside me said there was something wrong. The man kept watching me in a disturbing way, and the tension inside me only grew. When the bus approached my stop, I prepared to get off, trying not to look back. But panic grew in me when I realized the man had also gotten up, moving toward the door. My heart started to beat faster, and a sense of fear took over me. When the bus stopped, I quickly got off, almost running, hoping he wouldn't follow me. However, when I looked back, I saw that he had gotten off at the same stop and was walking toward me. I started to walk faster, feeling the fear turn into adrenaline. The streets that were once familiar now seemed dangerous, and every person I passed seemed indifferent to my situation. The man kept following me, maintaining the same distance, as if he was calculating every move. I didn't know what he wanted, but my instinct told me I needed to get out of there as quickly as possible. I saw a small market on the corner and decided it was my chance to escape. I ran to the door, pushing it open with force, and hurried inside. The place was almost empty, except for a woman at the checkout counter who looked at me in surprise when she saw my panicked expression. "Please help me," I said, my voice trembling. "There's a man following me." The woman at the checkout pulled me behind the counter, giving me a look of understanding. "Stay here. I'll call the police," she said, picking up the phone. I was terrified, my heart beating so fast it felt like it would burst out of my chest. Outside, through the windows, I could see the man standing on the sidewalk, looking into the market. He no longer looked neutral. There was something almost predatory in his gaze, and it made me tremble even more. The man stood there for a few moments, watching the movement inside the market. My mind was racing, imagining all the terrible things that could happen. But then, he saw the woman on the phone and realized I was asking for help. His expression changed, and he quickly looked away. Before I could process what was happening, he turned and started to walk away. I kept watching until I was sure he was out of sight. Even then, the fear didn't leave me. My thoughts were confused, and I could only think about calling my parents. When I finally did, my mom answered, and I started crying, telling her everything that had happened. She and my dad came to get me immediately, and as soon as they arrived, they hugged me tightly. My dad was furious, wanting to do something, but we didn't know who that man was or where he could be. The police arrived shortly after, and we filed a report. I told them everything that had happened, every detail I could remember. The officers were understanding, but made it clear that without knowing who the man was, it would be difficult to find him. They promised to patrol the area and advised me to avoid taking the bus alone for a while, which only heightened my anxiety. In the days that followed, I couldn't stop thinking about that man. Every time I left the house, I looked around, expecting to see him emerge from some corner. Even at home, I felt watched, as if he could show up at any moment. My parents were equally worried, and for several weeks, they took me to and from every place. What scares me the most to this day is the possibility that he's still out there, watching someone else, waiting for another moment to strike. That man, who seemed to be just another passenger on the bus, ended up becoming the center of my worst nightmares. The experience changed my perception of the world around me, and even years later, I'm still careful with every step I take. Even after all this time, the memory of that day has never completely faded. I still wonder what would have happened if I hadn't gone into that market, if he would have done something, or if it was all just a paranoia that, by luck, didn't end in tragedy. But no matter how many times I replay the events in my head, one thing is certain: that day taught me to trust my instincts and to never underestimate danger. As the months passed, I tried to return to normal, but something inside me had changed forever. My parents changed too. They became more protective, and discussions about safety at home became more frequent. And although the police never found the man, their promise to keep an eye on the area gave me some comfort. I never saw that man again, but the fear remains. And it's that fear, that constant sense of alertness, that stays with me to this day. No matter how much time passes, the memory of that day is etched in my mind, a reminder that danger can be where we least expect it, and that sometimes reality is far scarier than any story we can imagine. If you like these horror stories, you can't miss 9 Scariest Skinwalker Encounters I've Ever Heard compilation to watch. Click on the video link here on the card, or look for the previous video on this channel. And of course, leave your like, subscribe to the channel, and tell us in the comments if you've ever had a paranormal experience too. Stay brave, and see you in the next scary story.